Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're going to tackle something that might settle, or honestly, might stir up a debate you've probably had at a dinner party, or maybe even in your own head. Do we really love our pets the way we love our children? Now, before anyone gets defensive or dismissive, I want to say up front there's actual neuroscience behind this question now. Researchers have been putting people in brain scanners, measuring hormone levels, tracking neural synchrony between humans and animals, and the answer they're finding is complicated, which is what makes it genuinely interesting rather than just fodder for social media arguments. The short version? Your brain really does use overlapping circuitry when bonding with your pet and bonding with your child, but the patterns aren't identical. And unpacking why that is and what it means takes us into some fascinating territory about how mammalian brains evolved to connect with each other. Let me start with what we might call the brain's bonding blueprint. There's this core attachment network that neuroscientists have mapped out over decades of research, initially through studying mother infant pairs and romantic partners. It involves a constellation of brain regions working together: the amygdala, which processes emotional salience and helps you feel that someone matters to you; the cingulate cortex, particularly the anterior cingulate, which is involved in empathy and feeling connected to others; the striatum, which is your reward center and makes bonding feel good; the insula, which helps you sense your own body states and attune to others; and the hypothalamus, which orchestrates hormonal responses, including oxytocin release. When researchers first started imaging parents looking at their children, they saw this network light up reliably. Makes sense, right? Evolution would want to make sure we're deeply motivated to care for our offspring. What's more surprising is what happened when they started including pets in these studies. There's a body of work now showing that when mothers look at photographs of their children and their family dogs, many of these same regions activate. Not randomly similar regions, the same attachment related areas. The brain isn't creating a completely separate filing system for human bonds go here and animal bonds go over there. It's drawing on overlapping infrastructure. And this isn't just happening on the human side. Researchers have actually done functional magnetic resonance imaging studies on dogs, which, if you think about it, requires an incredibly patient and well trained dog willing to lie still in a noisy scanner. When dogs see their owners versus strangers, they show differential activation in attachment related areas too: the hippocampus, the caudate nucleus, areas tied to reward and memory. It seems to be a shared mammalian architecture for social bonding that predates the split between humans and other species. I find this genuinely moving in a way. It suggests that when you feel connected to your dog and your dog seems connected to you, you're both tapping into ancient neurobiological systems that evolved to create bonds between beings who depend on each other. But here's where we need to add some nuance, because the research doesn't support a simple pet love equals child love conclusion. A particularly elegant study from 2024 compared brain responses across 6 different types of love: romantic partners, children, friends, strangers, pets, and interestingly, nature. They wanted to see how the brain distinguishes between these different objects of affection. What they found is that while pet love absolutely activated reward and attachment regions, it was consistently less widespread and less intense than love for one's own children or romantic partner. The differences showed up in 2 main places. First, the subcortical reward structures, the deep brain areas that generate that visceral sense of something feeling really good and really important. Those fired more robustly for children than for pets. Second, areas involved in social cognition showed stronger engagement for human relationships. This social cognition piece is worth dwelling on for a moment. There's a region called the temporoparietal junction, which is heavily involved in theory of mind, your ability to understand that other beings have their own thoughts, feelings, and perspectives separate from yours. When people think about their human loved ones, the temporoparietal junction lights up strongly. When they think about their pets, it's more muted. Now, there's an interesting wrinkle in this data. In dedicated pet owners, people who really identify as pet people and have strong bonds with their animals, the brain activation patterns for pets looked more similar to interpersonal love than they did in people without strong pet attachments. Experience and relationship quality seem to shape the neural response. But even in these devoted pet owners, the activation didn't quite reach the same intensity or extent as child attachment. I think this nuance is important because it suggests the brain isn't being arbitrary or culturally programmed here. There may be evolutionary reasons why attachment to offspring, who carry your genetic legacy forward, would recruit more extensive and intense circuitry than attachment to an animal companion, no matter how beloved. Even if you adore your golden retriever with your whole heart, your brain seems to maintain some gradient of response that prioritizes human bonds, and especially bonds with your children. Does that mean pet love is somehow fake or lesser? I don't think that's the right conclusion either. It just means it's different in degree, not entirely different in kind. Let's talk about oxytocin for a while because this is where the research gets really interesting, especially when you start comparing across different species of companion animals. Oxytocin, as you probably know, is often called the love hormone or the cuddle chemical. It's released during childbirth, breastfeeding, physical affection, and social bonding of various kinds. It helps create feelings of trust, connection, and calm. And researchers have been measuring oxytocin levels in both humans and animals during their interactions to understand the biology of cross species bonding. Dogs, it turns out, are absolute champions when it comes to oxytocin responses to human interaction. Study after study shows that when pet dogs have affiliative contact with their owners, being stroked, gazed at, spoken to gently, just being physically close, their oxytocin levels rise measurably. You can track this in saliva, blood, or urine, depending on the study design. But here's what makes this finding more meaningful than it might first appear. Researchers did a clever comparison. They looked at pet dogs living in homes with their owners, and they also looked at wolves and dogs that had been raised by humans from puppyhood but lived in pack settings rather than as household pets. When these pack living animals had physical contact with familiar humans, guess what happened? Their stress hormones went up, not their oxytocin. The contact was arousing and maybe a bit stressful, not bonding. In pet dogs with their specific owners, though, oxytocin increased and cortisol stayed stable or decreased. The difference seems to be the relationship itself, the familiarity, the history, the ongoing bond. It's not just physical contact that triggers bonding chemistry. It's contact within the context of an attachment relationship. There's also fascinating work on genetic variation in dogs. Some dogs have variants in their oxytocin receptor genes that are associated with higher oxytocin levels, and in mother dogs, more attentive maternal care. This suggests that some lineages of dogs may have been selected over generations for stronger oxytocinergic responses, literally bred to bond more intensely with humans. Cats, as you might guess if you've ever lived with one, are more complicated about this. The research on feline oxytocin is genuinely mixed. Some studies show that owner initiated interaction is associated with higher oxytocin in cats, but other studies have found that cats' oxytocin actually increases when social interaction is restricted, which is very on brand for cats, honestly. It seems to depend heavily on the individual cat and particularly on their attachment style. Yes, cats have attachment styles. Researchers have adapted the strange situation paradigm that's been used for decades to assess infant attachment. You observe how the cat behaves when the owner leaves and returns, and they've found that cats can be categorized as secure, anxious, or avoidant in their attachment, just like human children or adults. Securely attached cats show oxytocin increases during positive interaction with their owners. Anxiously attached cats, though, start with higher baseline oxytocin levels and show smaller increases or even decreases during interaction. It's as if their bonding system is already running hot and dysregulated, which parallels what we see in anxiously attached humans. Horses fall somewhere in the middle in terms of clarity. Research shows clear oxytocin increases in horses about 15 minutes after gentle human contact like rubbing or just standing nearby. And there's an interesting personality connection. Horses with higher baseline oxytocin tend to be calmer, less fearful, less dominant, and more trainable. High oxytocin horses seem to be naturally more social and cooperative. What all this species comparison work tells us is that while the oxytocin system is conserved across mammals, its ancient biochemistry, the dynamics of how it gets activated are species specific and context dependent. Dogs seem almost uniquely primed for human bonding in a way that cats and horses and other companion animals aren't, at least not to the same degree or with the same reliability. This raises a question I think people intuitively wonder about. Does the brain have some kind of special category or module for loving animals? Is there a cross species attachment system that's distinct from how we bond with other humans? The current evidence suggests the answer is no, not really. What seems to happen instead is that your brain uses its general purpose attachment architecture, the same circuitry it uses for pair bonds, parent child relationships, close friendships, and extends it flexibly to animals when certain conditions are met. And those conditions matter a lot. Attachment theory, which originally grew out of John Bowlby's observations of infant mother bonds in the mid 20th century, defines attachment through behavioral criteria rather than through who or what you're attached to. An attachment figure serves as a secure base that you can explore the world from, a safe haven you return to when stressed or scared, someone whose absence causes distress, and someone whose return brings relief and joy. Here's what might be the most striking finding in this whole area. Dogs are currently the only non human animals that have been shown to meet all four of these attachment criteria in their bonds with humans. Not cats, though cats can be attached in some ways. Not horses. Not pigs. Even companion pigs raised in homes from infancy and given extensive human contact and socialization. Researchers specifically compared companion pigs to dogs, and despite the pigs having similar living situations and human exposure, they didn't show the same attachment behaviors. They didn't use their owners as a secure base the same way dogs do. They didn't show the same reunion responses. Dogs seem to have something, and it's probably some combination of their unique domestication history, specific selection for human oriented social behaviors, and perhaps something about canine cognition that matches up well with human cognition, that allows them to slot into the attachment system in a way other species don't. So the brain isn't building a new module for pet love as a separate category. It's more that dogs, specifically, have evolved to access and activate the existing human attachment system. They've become compatible with our bonding software in a way that other animals haven't, or at least not to the same extent. Now, let's get into something that might feel a bit more personal: what your human attachment style says about how you bond with pets. Attachment styles in humans, whether you're secure, anxious, or avoidant in your relationships, develop early in life based on your experiences with caregivers, and then tend to persist as working models for how relationships function. A securely attached person generally trusts that others will be there for them, feels comfortable with intimacy and independence, and doesn't worry excessively about abandonment. An anxiously attached person tends to crave closeness, but worry about rejection, often seeking reassurance. An avoidantly attached person tends to value independence, can feel uncomfortable with too much closeness, and may shut down emotionally when things get intense. Researchers have been asking whether these patterns transfer across species. If you're anxiously attached to humans, are you also anxiously attached to your cat? If you're avoidant with people, are you avoidant with your dog? The answer is yes, to a meaningful degree, but with important caveats. A meta analysis that pooled data from 12 different studies found a moderate positive correlation between interpersonal attachment anxiety and pet attachment anxiety, roughly in the range of 0.39, which in psychology is considered a medium effect. The correlation for avoidance was weaker but still positive, around 0.16. So your internal working models of relationships do carry over somewhat to how you relate to animals. But here's what I find most interesting. Across the board, people reported significantly lower anxiety and avoidance in their pet relationships than in their human relationships. Pet bonds, on average, are more secure than human bonds. This might partly explain why pets can feel so emotionally safe. Your dog isn't going to criticize you, leave you for someone else, bring up old arguments, or suddenly change the terms of the relationship. The relative simplicity and reliability of the bond may allow people to relax defenses that stay up in human relationships. There's a theory that for people with insecure human attachment, particularly those with anxious or fearful styles, pets can serve as compensatory attachment figures. Research supports this. Insecurely attached people, especially those high in attachment anxiety, often form stronger emotional bonds with their pets than securely attached people do. If you struggle to trust people or constantly fear rejection, a pet offers something that might feel more dependable. One study found that strong dog attachment was specifically linked to two things: lower comfort depending on or trusting other people, and greater fear of being rejected or unloved. These are hallmarks of insecure attachment. The interpretation isn't that these people are somehow deficient for loving their dogs so much. It's that the dog relationship may be meeting attachment needs that aren't being met or feel harder to meet in human relationships. And this isn't a reset of your attachment style. The underlying patterns are still recognizable. But the pet relationship seems to allow for a softened version, a context where security feels more achievable. It's worth noting that the quality of pet attachment has mental health implications that parallel human attachment. Secure attachment to pets is associated with better mood and psychological well being. Insecure attachment to pets, whether anxious or avoidant, tracks with more depressive symptoms. So it's not just having a pet that matters, it's the nature of the bond. There's also research showing that the pet's characteristics influence attachment style in the relationship. Dogs or cats that are more aggressive, less sociable, or show attention deficit hyperactivity disorder like behaviors tend to be associated with more avoidant attachment in their owners. It's not just about what you bring to the relationship, the specific animal shapes it too. I want to spend some time on the neural synchrony research because I think it captures something important about what's actually happening when humans and animals bond in real time. You might have heard about studies showing that mothers' and infants' brain activity synchronizes during face to face interaction. Their neural oscillations start to align, particularly in frontal regions associated with attention and social engagement. This synchrony is thought to be part of how the bond gets built and maintained, a kind of neural conversation happening below conscious awareness. Researchers have now done similar studies with humans and dogs. When people and their dogs engage in mutual gaze and petting, there's measurable interbrain synchronization, particularly in frontal and parietal regions. The coupling is strongest when gaze and touch are combined. When you're looking at your dog while petting them, your brains are most in sync. This isn't just an interesting curiosity. Neural synchrony appears to be functionally important for bonding. In mother infant research, greater synchrony predicts better attachment security and developmental outcomes. The fact that it occurs across species suggests that human dog interaction is tapping into the same coupling mechanisms that support human social development. What we don't have yet are direct head to head comparisons, the same people being scanned while interacting with their infant and then with their pet to see how the synchrony patterns compare. That would be the gold standard study, and researchers acknowledge it hasn't been done. So we're inferring overlap from parallel findings rather than proving identity through direct comparison. The subcortical pieces are also less well mapped for human animal interaction than for human human bonding. We know that parent infant attachment heavily involves deep brain structures like the ventral tegmental area, which is the origin of dopamine reward pathways, and that oxytocin modulates activity throughout this network. In human animal interaction, these pathways are inferred to be involved based on the behavioral and hormonal evidence, but the detailed neuroimaging work hasn't caught up to what exists for parent infant bonding. So there's this interesting situation where the evidence strongly suggests overlap in mechanisms, but the precision of mapping differs. We know more about what's happening in the brain during human human bonding because that's been studied longer and more intensively. Let me try to pull some threads together here about what this all means. The research paints a picture of the brain as having a flexible, general purpose attachment system rather than separate modules for different types of relationships. This system evolved to support the bonds that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, primarily parent offspring bonds and pair bonds, but also friendships and coalitions that provided protection and resource sharing. This architecture turns out to be extensible. Under the right conditions, it can incorporate beings from other species into its scope. Dogs, because of their unique evolutionary history as our companions over tens of thousands of years, are particularly well suited to meeting the conditions for attachment. They attend to human social signals, they seek proximity, they show distress at separation and joy at reunion. They gaze into our eyes in ways that trigger oxytocin release on both sides. But extensibility isn't identity. The brain maintains gradients in how strongly and extensively it responds to different attachment figures. Children recruit more reward circuitry, more social cognition, more subcortical activation than pets do, even beloved pets. This probably reflects evolutionary priorities. Your genetic legacy depends on your children in a way it doesn't depend on your dog. At the same time, the fact that pet bonds engage real attachment circuitry means they're not trivial or fake. When people say their pet is family, there's neurobiological truth to that. The brain is processing that relationship through genuine bonding systems, not through some separate, lesser category. For people with insecure human attachment, this flexibility might be particularly meaningful. If your early experiences taught you that human relationships are unreliable, dangerous, or rejecting, a pet can provide a context where the attachment system gets to operate with less threat, less complexity. This doesn't fix the underlying patterns. You're not going to resolve attachment wounds just by having a dog, but it might provide a kind of practice ground, or simply a reliable source of felt security that supports overall well being. I think there's also something profound in the cross species nature of these bonds. The fact that a human brain and a dog brain can synchronize during interaction, that both species release oxytocin in each other's presence, that both show activity in homologous attachment regions, it suggests that the capacity for connection is older and more fundamental than any particular species. We share it because we inherited it from common ancestors, and it continues to function across species boundaries when the behavioral conditions are right. The research also highlights how much individual differences matter. Not all dogs bond equally. Genetics influence oxytocin receptor functioning. Not all cats respond the same way to interaction. Their attachment style shapes what happens. Not all humans bring the same patterns to pet relationships. Your human attachment history leaves fingerprints on how you connect with animals. These aren't just statistical noise to be averaged out. They're part of the phenomenon itself. If I had to summarize the takeaway, it would be this: your brain does love your pet. It really does. It's using the same fundamental circuitry, the attachment networks, the reward systems, the oxytocin pathways that it uses for human bonds. When you gaze into your dog's eyes and feel that warmth, that's real neurobiology, not mere sentimentality or anthropomorphic projection. But the patterns aren't identical to child attachment. Love for children tends to be neurally stronger and more extensive, particularly in reward areas and regions supporting understanding of other minds. This probably reflects something deep about our evolutionary wiring. Offspring get priority because that's how genes propagate. What strikes me most, though, is the flexibility of it all. The brain didn't evolve a dedicated pet love module. It has a versatile bonding architecture that can extend under the right conditions to beings beyond our own species. Dogs have become remarkably good at meeting those conditions, which is why dog human bonds can be so intense and so meaningful for both parties. And for many people, especially those who find human relationships challenging or painful, that flexibility might be genuinely therapeutic, not as a replacement for human connection, and not as a way to avoid the harder work of human intimacy, but as a real form of attachment that provides security, comfort, and the felt sense of mattering to another being. The science here is still developing. We need those direct comparison studies, the same people scanned with their children and their pets. We need better mapping of subcortical activity and human animal interaction. We need longer term studies tracking how pet bonds develop and change over time, and how they influence human attachment patterns. But even with current limitations, the picture that emerges is one where the boundaries between human and animal love are more permeable than we might have assumed, where ancient mammalian circuitry gets recruited into modern relationships that our evolutionary ancestors couldn't have anticipated, and where the capacity for connection turns out to be remarkably robust and adaptable. Your dog may not be exactly like your child in your brain's processing, but they're not nothing either. There's something real, something that engages systems designed for the most important relationships in life. And I think that's worth knowing. Until next time, I'm Esther Adams. Take care of yourselves and your companions.